Welcome to this episode of the People Dividend. I'm your host, Mike Horne, and I am thrilled to have in our virtual studio today Nellie Wartoft, the CEO and founder of Tigerhall since 2019. And she is aiming to overhaul how large enterprises approach driving change, transformation, and knowledge sharing. So I know for so many of you in our audience who touch people and culture, who are human resources leaders or managers of business units and operations, you know the importance of linking effective communication with your change messages. And she brings lots of experience in sales and marketing at Michael Page. What really inspired her actually to create Tigerhall. So she's gained global recognition with this firm, attracting Fortune 500 firms and securing over $10 million in venture capital. The company operates in 32 countries and 12 markets, facilitating organizational engagement that drives buy-in and support for change and transformational initiatives. Nellie's entrepreneurial prowess earned her acclaim, including recognition on the 2021 Gen T list of Leaders of Tomorrow. Additionally, she's a Swedish national champion in skeet shooting and contributes to industry development on boards like the Swedish Chamber of Commerce Singapore. Driven by innovation and global outlook, Nellie continues to lead Tigerhall in transformative change, solidifying her legacy as a visionary in technology and business. Nellie, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. How's your shoulder after all the skeet shooting?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it. My shoulder as well. Okay. I was doing skeet shooting primarily when I was younger. And the national championship is something I won when I was 15. And then after that, I found it more fun to party than to fire off a ton of bullets. So I do it more for relaxation purposes now. But yeah, thanks to the good clothes that you have when you're skeet shooting, my shoulder is still doing pretty okay.
So let's talk about your story, and it's a fascinating story. You've lived in a number of places around the planet, some that are distinct in many ways. So let's talk about your journey and what led you to what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I was born in southern Sweden, in a small town in the middle of the forest, and I moved to Singapore on my own when I was 18.
Isn't Sweden all in the middle of the forest? That's a very rude thing to say. I apologize. But I just finished recently watching a Swedish television show, that was filmed in Sweden, sort of about astronauts and a post-apocalyptic experience.
Oh, wow. Astronauts in the middle of the forest. That doesn't sound like a good combination.
No, it wasn't.
Sounds like they should be somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. Most of Sweden is forest, and there are some mountains as well, but otherwise primarily forest. But yeah, I thought that was a little bit hard of a place to do what I wanted to do in life, which is why I decided to be the astronaut that then went over to Singapore at an early age. Was very obsessed with Asia and still am. Love Asia as a continent and the cultures and the history and the different countries and so on. So I wanted to live in the capital of Asia, and decided when I was 15 that that's probably Singapore, the capital of Asia. Decided between Singapore and Hong Kong. And then on my 18th birthday, I booked a one-way flight on Singapore Air, packed everything I had, and moved across to Singapore. And I've always been someone who's been working. I started working when I was 12, supporting an elderly home and stroke patients. And then I started at McDonald's when I was 14. I started selling suits when I was 16. Started my own enterprise, my own company when I was 17, which was an education business for senior citizens to teach them digital literacy. So I've always been working. So when I came to Singapore, I was doing my university studies in economics and law, and then also did a bunch of my own businesses around that time and internships and so on as well. And then the bulk of my corporate career I spent with Michael Page, as you mentioned, and was in one of those large organizations, London headquartered, ran a regional team, and something that I started thinking about a lot while in corporate was just this notion of how different it is, how we communicate and consume content and engage with people outside of work compared to what it is at work. And if
At
you've
work,
had a
it's
full
slow,
week,
bureaucratic. Why do I have to have another channel? In many ways, versus it's more difficult to figure out the informal systems of communication sometimes with so much electronic mediation.
yeah. And it's not like, I mean, outside, if you've had a weekend full of Spotify, Netflix, TikTok, Instagram, Amazon, you're not going to show up in the office on a Monday morning and be like, oh my God, there's a PDF on a SharePoint site. I
Right.
cannot wait to open this, right?
Right.
So people are very disengaged in those kind of formats and that way of communicating and sharing knowledge because we just don't have that attention span anymore, right? And it's just very, very far behind consumer preferences. So that was the very first thought that started me thinking around, like, how can we bring a more consumer grade experience into enterprises when it comes to sharing communication, information, and knowledge.
Nellie, even for things
So
as mundane as organizational announcements, or does it have to be on the more strategic end? And does it apply to small enterprises as well as large enterprises? What are your thoughts in that regard?
So it does apply to everything in many ways. And we work with a lot of like small, mid-sized companies as well who use it for everything. And you can use it for everything from organizational announcements and town halls and onboarding and so on. But where we've really narrowed in and what we do really well is really change and transformation, because that is where this really matters. Because if you think of like doing standard BAU internal comms, like it's kind of like still fine, you know, if people ignore it or if someone doesn't show up to a town hall and you catch like 10% of it, like people can still get by with that. But where this really starts to break down and you notice this is a huge problem is when it comes to change and transformation. Because
Yes,
when
I
you're
mean,
driving that kind of communications and enablement and training, then if people are not consuming, if they're not getting it, they're not going to change. And if people are not changing, then the change is not going to happen. So that's where it's much more critical to get this right. And that's the area that we focus on.
That's interesting. In one organization where I worked, I don't think employees who were very smart and very talented and went to school at prestigious universities and had usually multiple advanced degrees, I don't think any of them knew who anybody was in the organization, like the CFO or the CMO or the head of HR. I mean, they knew who the CEO was and they knew who the CXO was for their organization. And that was about the extent that they cared or knew about that, some of that, where so many people and so many other functions maintain a great interest in that. So it does lead to the question around change and transformation and how important it is to bring people on board in those circumstances. So what's the you had an experience that prompted you to move in this direction. What's the evidence that supports that?
That it works to do it this way. Yeah, so if you look at the way that both you have, like if you look at leading indicators, like take like just initial open rates and engagement rates, right? For email, most organizations worldwide have an open rate between 6 to 9% on those internal mass emails. Of course, an email from your boss has higher open rate, right? But those internal mass campaigns is 6 to 8-9%. Whereas on Tigerhall, a personalized podcast or a short video clip that gets between 70 to 80% open rate. So you already 10x the open rate if we look at the very first leading indicators. And that's kind of the start for everything else to then happen, right? Because if people actually open it, that means they're going to consume it. If they consume it, they're going to understand it. And you have like all of those ratios being higher, that ultimately leads to higher understanding, higher buy-in, higher involvement, and that leads to people driving the change and being the change and executing the change. And that is what ultimately leads to the change and transformation happening, which is driving those business outcomes that it was intended to do. So it's really about bridging the gap between strategy and execution, because you have this great strategy, you might have a great plan, but that plan needs to be put in action, and it needs to be put in action by people on the ground who can actually execute it. So it's really about closing that gap. So leading indicator, as basic as open rates to what we see in terms of lagging indicators being 6 times faster implementation and adoption. And if you look at topics like buy-in, for example, buy-in and engagement, we're seeing about 32 times higher buy-in for change initiatives when companies are using Tigerhall compared to an email, LMS, intranet, SharePoint kind of mess approach where people are just not catching up with everything that's happening.
It is a mess, all that SharePoint LMS. I mean, having managed a number of transformation projects, led transformation projects in organizations, and working with people across various disciplines who are interested in tracking progress, it is quite a bit of a mess. I also just find that I get so much better response with a personalized under 60-second video message that I can put in a DM or an email. My response rates are just so much higher. And I don't mean spam, for goodness sakes, but I mean with people I really want to connect with who are busy people. And I find that I get so much more response to a 60-second video. Hey, how you doing? Just checking in.
Yeah, it's the same with like the likelihood of people are much more likely to consume 30 minutes of 10-15 second clips than 10 minutes of one 10-minute clip.
Yeah,
so just breaking it down into these, like, the doom scrolling on TikTok and all of that, like people spend hours and hours and hours consuming content. And in those hours, like what teenagers today spend on TikTok in a day, they could actually read a whole book. But they're never going to read that whole book in a day, but they are going to doom scroll on TikTok for the same amount of time. Mm-hmm. And do I think that's good? No, I don't think so. But if we want to get a message across and cut through that noise and make people understand something, I think that's the way that we have to do it.
I wonder what my audience, this is a question for you. I wonder what you think of my TikTok channel. If you haven't, go out and like some of the clips that I put out there. I mean, we have a regular flow on topics of dignity and kindness and respect and how those will transform and shape the modern workplace. So I encourage you to visit my TikTok channel, give me some feedback on it. It's such an important media, and we're always trying to think about what's next, Nellie, and certainly AI has changed everything. It's changed the book writing business. It's changed how people produce content. What are your thoughts in this regard?
So I think, AI is obviously changing everything, and I'm not going to repeat what's obvious, but I do think something that is interesting is this analogy of even if an airplane can go at 1,000 kilometers an hour, we're still really interested as humans in how fast a human can run. We're still gathered around the Olympics and looking at who's the fastest human in the world, even though we have technology that goes so much faster than humans, right? And I think that that's where we're going to go with AI, or rather, I hope that's where we're going to go with AI, that it's actually going to increase interest in human quality, like in a lot of the things that aren't really based on human creativity or human depth, like just automated away, and everything like writing a job description probably doesn't require as much creativity. But I'm hoping that in the AI automation of all of those areas, that can then put an increased focus on a really, really good high quality book, for example, so that the human aspect and anything that is human created will still be generating that amount of interest, just like we are watching the Olympics, even if technology can go faster. So that's my hope for it, and that it will be a separation between like what AI does and what humans do.
Yeah, it's such a good thing. For example, in the area of job descriptions that you mentioned, I encourage every manager who has to write a job description to use some sort of AI to assist in that preparation. There are so many standard, repeatable processes that can be gleaned from that. There are a lot of other areas, in education, for example, we deal constantly with topics of AI and what is academic integrity and academic honesty. So these questions are out there for us, and if there's one thing, the advancing use of AI, may make people's jobs more difficult. But I like what you're saying. Instead of spending hours doom scrolling, people can go pick up a book it's so disappointing as an author to know. You look at Kindle stats, KDP. Somebody's reading your book on Kindle Unlimited. How many pages they get through? It's not many.
Oh, isn't it? Do you see a difference between how many they get through on Kindle and elsewhere?
Well, Amazon keeps track of it all for us. So, if you've downloaded the book on Kindle Unlimited, there's a record of how far you've read and how many pages you've read of that book, and the author gets to see that. I surmise that from the statistics in that regard that people don't get very far with books, especially business books. I think it's one thing if you're interested in a novel, and I think it's also about how you consume content, which is what makes Tigerhall so interesting to me, and I believe to our audience, is that I'm much more likely now to listen to an Audible than I am to read a book, because I spend so much time creating my own content in front of a screen.
Yeah, exactly. I also find it much more pleasant to read a book, and I'm a big fan of physical books. I don't want to read Kindle. I don't want to read on a screen. I spend my life in front of a screen, so any moment I can not be in front of a screen, I love it. So, and that's like with AI and everything as well. And we see this already a little bit with, like, for example, dating is something that has gone off the apps and back into in-person and offline. And I see that happening with communities as well, like, and especially Gen Z are very much about getting off technology and getting back to in-person as well. So there is a little bit of that pendulum swinging back in many areas, I think. And I do think / hope that the increase of AI will also force that pendulum to maybe force us to go back to what is truly human and human connection and focus a bit more on those areas of life.
Yeah, so I think what will persist is the dominance of hybrid work forms. I think people will eventually, more and more people will be back in offices. The questions in human resources we've been dealing with in 2022, 2023, 2024 are the same in 2025. People are still grappling with post-pandemic issues. What is a team culture? Many of these issues. And I wonder what are you seeing in organizations that are driving transformation? Some organizations have had miserable success. They have a lot of people who do the sip and goes. They come in for the espresso bar, they clock in, and then they walk out of the building because nobody's recording when you're walking out.
I don't really see a correlation between successful transformation and remote work policies. I think, those tend to happen fairly in isolation. Like on successful transformation, there are so many other things that I think matter much more. And from a remote work, return to office policy, like that is a change in itself. And there are many change leaders who are tasked with driving that type of change. Personally, I think it's a bit like missing the point. I mean, it should be more focused on the outcomes and what people are doing and what they're achieving rather than where they are. Tigerhall is fully remote, for example, and for me, it comes down to who I hire and being able to trust them, and then measuring actual outcomes. Because I think that many companies are very adamant about return to office, also organizations that maybe aren't that great with measuring outcomes. But then I do understand, like, you want people in person for the serendipity and building culture. And like, we also, like, I make sure that people in Tigerhall get together in person regularly as well. So I'm not discounting in person, but I think in person needs to be intentional. And when you get together, you're doing that for... Yeah, and like you're getting together in person with an intention to have a meeting, for example. I think what the reason people are very frustrated, employees are very frustrated with this type of change, right, is that it doesn't really make any sense. And it's coming from executives who are not experiencing what they experience day to day. So they drive all the way to an office, a 2-3 hour commute for many, and then they sit there and they are in a phone booth on virtual calls all day, and then they drive home. And then, of course, like, that doesn't make any sense. Why can't I just be at home instead, right? So I think just like any change initiative, it has to make logical sense. You have to have a story around it. You have to tell why people should care and what's in it for them. And I think many RTO mandates and that type of change has just missed many of the critical components of driving a successful change.
Well, so true. And, coming back to a focus on the work I do is helping leaders to foster trust and integrity and emotional intelligence to drive meaningful change. And an essential part of that, particularly in large, complex organizations, or organizations small, medium, and large alike, is figuring out the communication patterns. It's about creating a sense of community. That's what I like to work on with my clients. I don't worry about certain shifts in economies, because what's true or unique, what's common, not unique, what's common among all my clients is they're all engaged in some sort of transition, whether it's a transition from one behavioral state to another behavioral state, from one leadership to a role to another leadership role, from a board-directed intervention into the executive team, to a redesign of an organization, an R&D organization. All of these are periods of transition. So being able to, have messages crafted to support those transitions are so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, in the last few minutes we have remaining, Nellie, what advice, trends, guidance do you have for our listening audience, particularly those in people and culture activities?
I think for people and culture activities, like I always like the analogy with marketing in general, like thinking a little bit more like a marketing person, and thinking through when if you're driving a change from a people and culture perspective, like understanding your audience deeply, understanding who they are, doing things that are personalized for them, that meets a real need that they have, that actually solves for a pain point and solves for a challenge that they have. Measuring things, seeing like A/B testing, what works, what doesn't, always be learning. But yeah, I think many people and culture leaders do things that they think are great that maybe the audience doesn't think are so great or doesn't meet a real need for the audience. And they bring in a lot of frameworks and things that they have learned in their school of thought instead of thinking from the end user's perspective and what would they actually like. So I think that would be my advice, is to know your audience deeply, understand them, solve for real business challenges and real pain points, not something for just generic people and culture stuff, and measure the outcome and keep learning what works and what doesn't work, and double down on what works and remove what doesn't.
Boy, such sage advice. I often think, as a social scientist or someone in executive and organization development who spent a lot of time in school, is that I never met a model I didn't like. But I think in organizational life, it's really always dreadful to see another 4x4 model. So I appreciate your sage advice and insight and wisdom. Nellie, if people want to continue a conversation with you or be in touch with your work, how do they do that? We'll have it in the show notes for everyone too.
So the best way to connect with me is LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. You find me on Nellie Wartoft, and connect with me and write to me, and I always respond.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nellie Wartoft. It's been a delight to be in conversation with you on the important topics of communication and change and meaningful transformation. So until the next episode of the People Dividend, stay well.